The conference room of Forrester Creations was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tap of Eric's cane against the marble floor. The morning sun streamed through the wide glass windows, illuminating the sheen of tension that clung to every face around the long mahogany table. This was supposed to be a creative review, another of the countless meetings where ideas clashed and egos flared. But somewhere between Ridge's clipped sentences and Eric's measured fury, something essential broke. The air was thick with years of unspoken resentments, the accumulated weight of a legacy stretched too thin between pride and progress. Eric had built Forrester Creations with his bare hands and the fire of a dream that refused to die. Every stitch, every sketch, every collection bore traces of his soul. But lately, the company no longer felt like his. The son he once trusted above all others now spoke to him as though he were a relic, an obstacle in the way of innovation. Ridge's words, polished but merciless, cut through him. The brand must evolve, father, not live in your nostalgia. Those words were meant to sound pragmatic, but to Eric, they were a death sentence, the slow erasure of everything he had ever loved. He leaned forward, his hand trembling slightly, though whether from anger or age, no one could tell. The Forrester name, he said, his voice taut, was not built on algorithms and market trends. It was built on art, on family. But Ridge's expression remained impassive, the sharp lines of his face betraying nothing but the quiet certainty of a man convinced he was right. When Steffi interjected, trying to ease the growing storm between them, Eric silenced her with a look. This wasn't about mediation. It was about legacy, and legacies demanded clarity, not compromise. As the argument escalated, the board members exchanged uneasy glances. Hope sat near the end of the table, her posture rigid, her eyes darting between father and son like someone witnessing history's cruel symmetry. To her, it was more than a generational clash. It was the embodiment of ambition eating its own heart. She could feel the room's air thicken as voices rose, Ridge's measured rationality clashing against Eric's impassioned defense of tradition. The tension crescendoed until even the light seemed to dim. Then it happened, sudden, sharp, almost soundless. Eric's hand flew to his chest. His breath hitched, a small gasp that froze the entire room. The papers before him scattered as he stumbled back, knocking over his chair. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ridge was beside him, his face drained of color, calling for help, his hands trembling as he tried to steady his father's failing pulse. The sight of Ridge, always so composed, so in control, breaking into helpless panic, was unbearable. "Dad," he whispered, though the words seemed to echo from somewhere far away. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but time had already betrayed them. Eric's body, frail yet proud, gave its final resistance before surrendering. On the way to the hospital, Ridge clung to hope with the desperation of a man bargaining with fate. But as the sirens wailed through the streets of Los Angeles, Eric Forrester, patriarch, designer, dreamer, took his last breath. The world seemed to tilt with him. The call came 30 minutes later. Ridge didn't cry. Not at first. He simply stood there, the weight of his father's death pressing into the hollow of his chest until the numbness cracked into disbelief. The news rippled through Forrester Creations like a storm tearing through glass. Employees whispered in corridors, models wept behind closed doors, and the design room, once alive with music and laughter, fell silent. But grief, in the Forrester family, was never pure. It was braided with history, jealousy, and the relentless undercurrent of inheritance. The funeral was elegant, understated, every flower a testament to Eric's taste. Yet beneath the polished veneer of mourning, everyone knew the real battle was about to begin. When the lawyer announced a private reading of Eric's will, no one expected it to be anything but formal. Ridge, already assuming his succession, carried himself with quiet authority, convinced his father's final words would reaffirm the inevitable. But when the lawyer's voice began to tremble halfway through the reading, Ridge's confidence faltered. Eric's will was not the straightforward endorsement his son expected. Instead, it was a challenge, one final design from a man who had never stopped creating, even in death. In the document, Eric acknowledged Ridge's contributions but expressed deep concern over the erosion of artistic integrity within the company. He stated his belief that the next phase of Forrester Creations should be guided by a perspective untainted by ego, but driven by vision. And then came the name, not Ridge, but Steffi. She was to serve as interim CEO for 1 year, with full authority to uphold what Eric termed the soul of Forrester. If, after that period, the board judged her stewardship successful, she would retain control indefinitely. The room fell silent. Ridge's face turned pale, his lips parting in disbelief. For a moment, he looked as though the ground had vanished beneath him. Steffi, equally stunned, sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't sought this power. She had merely wanted peace between the men she loved most. Yet in that instant, she understood that peace had never been part of her family's inheritance. The clauses didn't end there. Eric had included an alternative trustee. In the event Steffi declined, the position would pass to Hope Logan, whose commitment to compassion and creativity Eric admired. That final twist hit Ridge like a blade. Hope, the daughter of Brooke, the woman whose presence had always complicated his relationship with his father, was now written into the very heart of Eric's legacy. It was both poetic and cruel, and Ridge's control shattered under the weight of it. In the days that followed, grief mutated into resentment. Ridge began to question the authenticity of the will, suggesting manipulation, perhaps even forgery. He demanded a legal review, citing his father's declining health and possible confusion in his final months. But Steffi refused to let his anger erase their father's final wishes. He knew what he was doing, she said quietly, though her own voice trembled with doubt. The more Ridge pressed, the more she resisted, until their once unbreakable bond fractured into open hostility. The board, split between loyalty and pragmatism, became a battlefield. Lines were drawn. On one side stood Ridge, armed with his years of experience, his name, and his belief that Forrester Creations was his birthright. On the other stood Steffi, younger, but fierce, guided by a vision that blended tradition with innovation. Hope, caught in the crossfire, became an unlikely fulcrum of power. Her calm demeanor and growing influence over public perception gave her a leverage that neither Ridge nor Steffi could ignore. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate about a hidden addendum, a sealed letter Eric had instructed to be opened only in the event of a legal dispute. Its existence became the obsession of everyone involved. Ridge saw it as proof of manipulation. Steffi saw it as the final word from the man who had taught her strength. When the letter was finally unsealed, it revealed not financial secrets, but something far more intimate. Eric's confession that he had always feared his love for Ridge had blinded him to his son's arrogance. He wrote that only through loss would Ridge understand the difference between power and purpose. The revelation devastated Ridge. For days, he isolated himself, avoiding the office, haunted by his father's last words. His grief curdled into guilt, then into defiance. He vowed to reclaim Forrester Creations, not just for himself, but to prove his father wrong. Yet every move he made only deepened the divide. Steffi, forced to lead under scrutiny, discovered that the weight of leadership was heavier than she had imagined. Every decision she made, from budget allocations to creative direction, was met with suspicion. Hope, outwardly supportive, began to subtly maneuver, building alliances among board members, securing influence through charm and diplomacy. In the press, Forrester Creations was no longer a fashion house, but a dynasty unraveling in real time. Articles speculated about internal betrayal, creative stagnation, and a potential hostile takeover. Bill Spencer, sensing opportunity, began circling like a shark, hinting at merger proposals and offering to stabilize the brand. Each headline chipped away at the company's prestige. As months passed, Steffi's confidence grew colder, sharper. The innocence she once carried replaced by the resolve of someone forged in fire. Ridge, meanwhile, drifted further into obsession, hiring private investigators to uncover irregularities in the company's finances. What he found was explosive: off-the-record investments made under Eric's name that linked back to anonymous accounts. To Ridge, it was proof that someone had manipulated Eric in his final days. To Steffi, it was another sign that Ridge could not accept loss. Their final confrontation came in the same boardroom where it all began. The table between them felt like a battlefield scarred by memory. Ridge's voice was no longer steady. It carried the rawness of a man who had lost too much to pride. Steffi, though visibly shaken, met his fury with calm defiance. "This isn't about you or me," she said. "It's about him, and what he wanted." But Ridge's reply was colder. "He wanted me to lead. He just didn't know how much." By then, the legal war had become inevitable. Lawsuits were filed, alliances shifted, and every member of the Forrester family was forced to choose a side. Brooke tried to mediate but found herself drawn into the chaos when Ridge accused Hope of conspiring with Steffi to seize control. The company, once synonymous with elegance, now stood as a monument to division. And yet, beneath the chaos, something remarkable began to happen. Steffi's leadership, though controversial, reinvigorated the brand. Collections inspired by Eric's classic designs, modernized through her vision, began to draw critical acclaim. Hope's line flourished alongside it, bringing a new generation of consumers. For the first time, Forrester Creations began to feel alive again, not because of one man's control, but because of many voices finally being heard. When Ridge eventually returned to the office months later, the space felt different. His father's portrait hung in the lobby, newly framed, his eyes watching with the same quiet authority as always. Ridge stood before it, exhausted, humbled, realizing too late what Eric had meant by vision. It wasn't about power or legacy. It was about evolution, about learning to let go. The company survived, though not without scars. The family, fractured but breathing, learned to exist within its contradictions. And somewhere, in the quiet halls of Forrester Creations, Eric's spirit lingered, not as a ghost of regret, but as a reminder that greatness is never inherited. It is earned, rebuilt, and redefined by those brave enough to love it beyond themselves. In the end, his death was not the end of Forrester Creations. It was the moment it truly began again. The world that Eric Forrester left behind was one built on silk, ambition, and the quiet ache of legacy, a world where beauty had always been both armor and weapon. When he died, that world did not shatter instantly. It cracked, like fine porcelain under strain, showing fractures no one dared to acknowledge at first. Ridge stood at the center of that silence, a man undone not by the weight of loss alone but by the realization that he had never learned how to live without his father's shadow to define him. And beside him, unexpectedly, uneasily, stood Brooke and Taylor, two women who had once built their lives in opposition to each other, now forced into an alliance neither fully trusted nor entirely wanted. 4 days after the funeral, the Forrester mansion felt suspended in time. Every object in Eric's study, the sketches, the cufflinks, the half-finished design draped on a mannequin, seemed to hum with unfinished intention. Brooke lingered there more often than she admitted, touching the fabrics as though they still held warmth. She had loved Eric in a way few understood, not as a husband or mentor, but as the constant who steadied her through decades of storms. Yet love and loyalty in the Forrester family were never clean things. They were woven through with guilt, pride, and 1,000 unspoken debts. Ridge's grief was quieter, more dangerous. He spent long hours in the design office, sitting before his father's last collection, tracing the lines on paper with trembling fingers. He was tormented by memories of their final argument, his harsh words about modernizing the brand, his father's refusal to yield. Those moments now replayed in his mind with surgical precision, each one cutting deeper than the last. Brooke tried to comfort him, but Ridge pulled away, consumed by the belief that his ambition had killed the man who gave him everything. Taylor, returning from Europe for the funeral, entered this landscape of sorrow like a bomb that only half healed. She had always been Ridge's quiet conscience, the one who believed love could redeem, even when it failed. But this time, even she was unsure where redemption ended and denial began. Brooke greeted her with practiced civility, masking old insecurities beneath a polished smile. For a brief, fragile moment, they were united by purpose: to protect Ridge, to keep Forrester Creations from collapsing under the weight of grief and boardroom warfare. It was an alliance born not of friendship but of necessity, and like all things in the Forrester orbit, it was destined to fracture under the pressure of emotion. As they navigated the days following Eric's death, the air in the Forrester home grew heavy with conflicting loyalties. Taylor noticed the toll that guilt was taking on Ridge: the sleepless nights, the half-finished sketches, the way he stared at his father's portrait as though waiting for judgment. She urged him to forgive himself, to see that Eric's death was not his doing but life's inevitable cruelty. Brooke, however, took a different approach, insisting that Ridge honor his father by reclaiming the company, by proving he could lead with strength. Their differing philosophies soon collided in quiet but venomous exchanges, words that began as concern but curdled into accusation. Taylor's patience was tested further when her focus began to drift elsewhere, toward Deacon Sharp. He had been one of the few people outside the Forrester circle to attend Eric's service, standing at a respectful distance, eyes lowered, grief shadowed by restraint. Taylor noticed him in the crowd, the quiet strength, the subtle compassion that came without agenda. When she later ran into him at Il Giardino, their conversation was unexpectedly easy, almost soothing. He understood loss, he said, without trying to fix it. It was the kind of comfort Ridge, wrapped in guilt and ego, could no longer provide. Brooke, meanwhile, was drawn back into the gravitational pull of Forrester politics. As interim chairwoman of the board, she faced mounting pressure to stabilize the company's public image. Investors were skittish, designers conflicted, and whispers about leadership divisions had begun leaking to the press. Hope and Steffi were barely on speaking terms, and Thomas, restless and volatile, threatened to quit altogether. Brooke's attempts at diplomacy only highlighted how precarious her position was. She was both insider and outsider, the eternal muse turned reluctant matriarch, expected to soothe chaos while holding her own fractured heart together. The strain deepened the cracks in her alliance with Taylor. Every conversation between them became a careful negotiation of boundaries, a dance between shared grief and old rivalry. Brooke accused Taylor of enabling Ridge's self-pity, while Taylor countered that Brooke's fixation on control was poisoning the healing process. Their truce, fragile from the start, began to unravel when rumors surfaced of Taylor's growing closeness with Deacon. Brooke denied it mattered, yet the thought of Taylor finding comfort in a man who had once shared her bed ignited a spark of jealousy she couldn't entirely suppress. Deacon himself was caught between the gravity of two women who represented opposite poles of his past and future. Brooke had been his undoing once, the fire that consumed his better judgment, but Taylor offered something quieter, a kind of peace he had never known. And yet, even peace could become dangerous when it threatened old loyalties. Word of their meetings soon reached Ridge, whose fragile emotional state twisted concern into suspicion. Confrontations followed, bitter, circular, impossible to resolve. As Forrester Creations wobbled on the edge of collapse, Bill Spencer watched from his towered office like a predator scenting blood. The news of Eric's will and Ridge's erratic leadership had spread quickly through industry circles, and Bill saw what others feared: opportunity. He had always thrived in moments like this, when the line between compassion and conquest blurred. His empire, sleek, ruthless, and efficient, was everything the Forresters were not. Where they led with emotion, he led with calculation. And in chaos, calculation was power. Bill's first move was subtle. He reached out to Katie Logan under the pretense of concern, inviting her to lunch to discuss family. She resisted at first, wary, skeptical, but curiosity and the exhaustion of grief wore her down. Over wine and quiet music, Bill unveiled his plan: He wanted her to head Spencer Publications' PR division, to rebrand the company for a new era. He spoke not as the manipulative mogul she remembered, but as a man offering redemption. "You have always been the heart I lack," he told her softly. "I need that now more than ever." Katie hesitated, torn between professional loyalty to Forrester and the allure of rebuilding something of her own. She had grown weary of living in the shadows of her sisters, Brooke, the eternal star, Donna, the gentle spirit. Bill's offer promised autonomy, purpose, and the chance to prove her worth on her own terms. But accepting it meant leaving Forrester at its weakest moment and abandoning Ridge, Brooke, and Hope when they needed her stability most. The decision haunted her for days, until one evening she found herself in Eric's old office, the air still carrying traces of his cologne. She sat at his desk, running her fingers across the grain of the wood, remembering how often he had spoken about legacy, not as inheritance, but as responsibility. That memory solidified her choice. She resigned from Forrester Creations the next morning. Her departure sent shockwaves through the company. Brooke felt blindsided, interpreting it as betrayal. Ridge saw it as another sign of collapse. And when Katie announced she was taking Will with her to start a new life under Spencer Publications, the ripple effects tore through both families. Bill capitalized on every fracture. He welcomed Katie with open arms, promoting her move as a story of empowerment. Under her leadership, Spencer Publications launched an aggressive campaign that spotlighted innovation and resilience, thinly veiled jabs at Forrester's turmoil. The media devoured it, painting the Spencer family as the new symbol of stability. What had once been a simmering rivalry between two business dynasties now erupted into open competition. Brooke, already fragile, saw Bill's maneuver as personal betrayal layered atop professional warfare. Her private fury burned beneath the surface, made worse by the whispers that Bill's true motive was not business, but Brooke herself, that his attempts to win Katie back were a calculated performance to draw Brooke's attention. When she confronted him, his response was characteristically ambiguous. "I never stopped caring for you," he said, eyes sharp and unreadable. "But maybe caring for you means reminding you who you used to be, before you became afraid of your own power." That sentence lingered like smoke. Brooke hated how it resonated, how it exposed the part of her that missed ambition as much as love. But she also knew that every decision she made now carried consequences for the Forrester name. She could not afford distraction, not from Bill, not from her own past. So she poured her energy into saving what remained of the company, rallying Steffi and Hope to rebuild their father's vision in Eric's absence. Yet even unity came at a cost. Steffi's leadership instincts clashed with Hope's idealism, each accusing the other of exploiting their grandfather's legacy for personal gain. Meanwhile, Ridge drifted further from them all, lost between remorse and resentment. His relationship with Brooke, already fractured, deteriorated under the pressure of unspoken blame. Every conversation between them returned to Eric's death, to the decisions that could not be undone. Brooke tried to reach him, but Ridge retreated into the only place that still felt like control: work. He poured himself into designing, channeling grief into obsession, until even his sketches began to reflect his unraveling mind. Taylor watched this descent with a mixture of sorrow and clarity. She knew Ridge's pain too intimately. She had once believed she could heal it with love. Now, she understood that grief this profound could only consume. Her connection with Deacon deepened in the quiet spaces Ridge had abandoned. What began as consolation evolved into intimacy, a relationship built on shared weariness and mutual respect. But when Brooke discovered their closeness, it reignited every dormant rivalry between them. "You couldn't resist," Brooke told her one evening, her voice trembling with fury and heartbreak. "You always find your way back to the men who belong to someone else." Taylor's reply was calm but laced with truth. "Maybe I'm just tired of pretending any of them ever really belonged to you." The confrontation marked the end of their alliance. What had begun as an attempt to protect Ridge and Eric's legacy dissolved into something darker. Two women once united by tragedy, now divided by pride. And as they turned on each other, the foundation of Forrester Creations began to quake again. Employees left, contracts faltered, and whispers spread that perhaps the era of Forrester dominance was finally ending. Yet through the chaos, one unyielding truth emerged. Eric's death had not destroyed the Forrester family. It had revealed it. The passion, the envy, the love, and the need for control that had always driven them were now laid bare. In the ruins of old loyalties, new identities began to form. Brooke, stripped of illusion, rediscovered her strength not as someone's muse, but as her own architect. Taylor, through her bond with Deacon, found a kind of honesty she had never allowed herself before, love without illusion, affection without rescue. Katie, at Spencer Publications, blossomed into the leader she had always been capable of becoming, though at the cost of familial peace. And Ridge, finally alone, faced the truth his father had tried to teach him all along, that legacy is not a name carved in marble but a choice renewed every day, to build, to forgive, to evolve. Standing in the Forrester showroom one night, surrounded by the ghosts of his family's brilliance, he looked up at Eric's final sketch, a gown of ethereal white, unfinished, like the man himself, and realized that the design had never been meant for completion. It was a reminder that creation, like family, is never final. It is a cycle of breaking and rebuilding, of love fractured and restored in new forms. By the time spring came, the House of Forrester had begun to heal, not through unity, but through acceptance. The pain remained, but so did the beauty. The echo of Eric's laughter still lingered in the studio, faint but unmistakable, woven into the seams of every fabric his family touched. And though they stood divided, Brooke and Taylor, Ridge and Bill, Katie and Hope, they all carried a fragment of his vision within them. That art, like love, survives even the most devastating losses. In the end, Eric's greatest design was not a gown or a legacy, but the fragile, imperfect family he left behind, still fighting, still creating, still alive.